And hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So I've been wanting to do such a video for quite a while where I rank programming languages depending on how I see them and if they match the certain criteria. So we'll be ranking these programming languages based on of 6 categories. First off is the performance. How fast does the code run? Then it's the syntax. How does the code look? Is it easily readable? And so on. The learning difficulty. Is it difficult to learn this language, especially if you're a beginner? The use difficulty, because sometimes what you learn does not always reflect how you use it in the real world. The popularity. So how popular this language is, meaning how big the community is and how easy it is to find help. And in my personal opinion. Now, just because a language gets ranked low here does not necessarily mean it's bad, and you'll notice this. Sometimes some languages are ranked in A rank, but some people might even consider those languages E ranked. First off, I would like to talk about Golang. Performance-wise, Golang was built to be fast, so its performance is pretty good. It can be compared to Java. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower, but overall it's still pretty good in terms of performance. Syntax-wise, at first you'll probably think the syntax is pretty gross, but the more time you spend using it, the more you'll start to actually appreciate and prefer that syntax. So that's definitely an upside as well. The learning difficulty is not too bad. Go basics are pretty easy. It was made with simplicity in mind, so classes and a bunch of other data structures were merged into one data structure, and that's a struct. You only have one type of loop, which is the for loop, and that's better than having 3 different loops, which are the for loop, the while loop, the do while, and how many other loops you have. So it's pretty easy considering that you have less to learn because everything can be done with one thing now. The use difficulty, well, thanks to Go simplicity, sometimes it's both easier and more difficult to use what you have learned and apply it in the real life. Mainly thanks to it having pointers and a few core features built in for simplicity's sake. But will get easier the more you use it, just like with any other language. But an example could be if you want to split a string and insert something in the middle of that string, or remove a letter from the middle of that string, it can be pretty difficult because of how the simplicity has been built into it. As for popularity, Go is rapidly increasing in popularity, and for a good reason. It is somewhat easy to find answers to your questions, and the Go community, from what I've experienced, are very friendly and open to helping you if you have any trouble. And for my opinion, I love Go. I want to code more with it, and it is personally a great language. Thanks to all of this, we can rank it here in A tier. If it just wasn't so difficult thanks to the simplicity, I would have probably ranked this S tier. Next up is Java. So, in terms of performance, the performance isn't great, but it's a good baseline. Something is either as fast as C or C++, or it's slower than Java. It gives you a good idea how fast something is. But Java itself isn't necessarily slow. The syntax is not great, but Java code is relatively easy to read depending on how much you know about programming. However, boilerplate causes this rating to go down, since it makes the reading and understanding more difficult and more tedious. The learning difficulty is often seen as incredibly difficult, mainly because of the hordes amount of boilerplate code and complex types and Gradle. The difficulty itself is unfortunately only going to get more difficult in the real world, so it's definitely not going to be the same or easier. In terms of popularity, Java is one of the oldest and most popular programming languages. So it has a massive community and a ton of answers to a ton of questions. In fact, if you have a question, there's a good chance it has already been answered. In my opinion, I don't like Java. I like the idea behind it, a virtual machine that runs your code, so it works on all platforms as long as you have Java installed. But Java itself is pretty disgusting, and right here we can put that in D tier. And this is an example of where just because something is rated in a certain way doesn't mean you should or should not learn it. You should still learn Java if you feel you want to. Even if I gave it a low rating here, it can still be considered a B tier or even higher language. I just ranked it D tier because for me, it didn't really quite cut it. Next up is HTML. And this isn't a programming language, but I still felt like I wanted to include this. Performance-wise, HTML is pretty fast. However, it is more dependent on the browser than the language itself. Syntax-wise, to the untrained eye, HTML can look difficult to read and confusing. But the syntax is really simple once you know the basics. Even if you just spend 10 minutes looking at the code, you'll probably start learning HTML just by looking at it. The learning difficulty is pretty low. You can learn HTML in a few hours if you wanted to. It's not very difficult at all. In real life, the HTML doesn't really get more difficult. It's as easy as it gets. What you learn is what you can apply to a real life website. The most difficult part of HTML is the SEO. But overall, HTML is pretty easy. HTML is also incredibly popular because it is the backbone of all websites. There are billions of websites out there, so it's safe to say that it is incredibly popular. I don't like or dislike HTML, but it does suck that it's mainly used for websites and doesn't really get used outside of that. So creating software is basically useless unless you want to use Electron or something similar to that if you wanted to use HTML. And we'll put it in an A tier, right here. You can't really see that, but it's an A tier. Now next up we have CSS. Performance-wise, I don't even know if this applies to CSS, but I'll assume it's pretty fast since I've never really had to wait for CSS to execute. Syntax-wise, if you can't understand CSS, then you scare me. It's about as easy as it gets. Even if you've never touched CSS in your life, you should still be able to understand the basics of it, at least. The learning difficulty isn't very difficult. It's possibly the easiest language you can learn. And CSS can become complex depending on your situation, but usually what you learn can actually be used in real life scenarios. Popularity-wise, CSS is used alongside HTML, and HTML is used to create websites. And Google has millions, if not billions of websites per search result. So it's incredibly popular. You'll struggle not finding answers to your questions since they were probably already asked, and the community is incredibly large since all the HTML community probably knows CSS and is part of the CSS community. In my opinion, if you know HTML, learn CSS. If you like design, learn CSS. CSS is super easy. The only downside is that you only use it on websites, just like with HTML. There's occasional times where you don't just use it on websites, but for the most part, you don't use it outside of web design. Therefore, it gets an A tier. JavaScript. Performance-wise, JavaScript isn't the best. It gets beaten by a lot of languages, so unfortunately, it is going to lose this point. Syntax-wise, when I think of a generic programming language syntax, I think of JavaScript. It's easy to read and usually easy to understand, depending on the developer. The learning difficulty is also relatively easy. It's mostly just a lot of things you have to learn, so the amount you have to learn is usually worse than the actual difficulty of learning it. In practice, JavaScript can be both easy and difficult, but usually it more depends on the programmers working on the project. usually it is easy to use in practice. So if what you've learned, you could usually apply to real world examples. Popularity wise, just like with HTML and CSS, JavaScript is used with websites. However, JavaScript is also used to create servers, mobile and desktop applications as well these days. So it's just as popular as HTML and CSS, if not more popular. And in my opinion, it's a great language. But the lack of typing can sometimes make me struggle to keep track of what works and how everything goes about it. So you'll notice with Go, Java, C++, you have these nice types, so something is a number or something is a string. In JavaScript, it's dynamically typed, so you can't necessarily specify this is a number and then later on get actual documentation for that because you specified it's a number, because it can change at any point in the program. There are also millions of libraries to choose from, so you could struggle figuring out what library to learn after learning vanilla JavaScript, which unfortunately bumps this down to a B tier. Next up is a TypeScript. Whilst it is not necessarily a new programming language, it's just JavaScript but with types, I think it still deserves to be on this tier list. TypeScript is just like JavaScript, but with types. However, the code it produces can potentially be a bit slower than normal JavaScript, since it does usually produce a few more lines of code, which can put a little bit of extra load on your JavaScript. Syntax-wise, it's the same as JavaScript, but now also add types, which could make it much easier to read. It has a slightly deeper learning curve than JavaScript, but the chances are that you already know JavaScript before you start learning TypeScript. So basically, you're just learning types. So it's not very difficult on the end of the day. What you learn can easily be converted to real life. However, it is usually scaled up a lot more. So now the code can be somewhat difficult to follow along with, because now there's a bunch of models and interfaces and stuff created that you now have to learn. And now because of that, it can be a bit more difficult or tedious to find a solution to your problem. Popularity wise, it's only a matter of time before TypeScript is more popular than JavaScript. It has the same community as JavaScript, but it's just a bit smaller. And in my opinion, TypeScript is my third favorite programming language. I love having enforced types. It makes code easier to read and understand, as well as keep the bugs away. We'll put this in B tier, but some might say it should go in A or even S tier. But I'm just going to put it here in B tier. But personally, I would have put it here in A tier if I had full control over it here. Lua. Performance-wise, just like most interpreted programming languages, performance is lacking. It's definitely not the best. And I've run into a few performance issues myself, although my code wasn't optimized for performance either, so that might just have been on my side, but usually my code isn't optimized for performance and I usually don't get such a laggy behavior. Syntax-wise, it is incredibly easy. My only complaint would be the begin and end instead of using normal brackets, since that's a lot more typing, but that might actually make it easier to learn as well as read if you don't know any other programming languages. The learning difficulty is fairly easy, with simplicity about as much as Go's, but the learning curve even lower than that of Go's. The using difficulty is also pretty easy. Unlike with Go, where the simplicity gets in the way, here it oftentimes helps keep the code easy to read and follow along. So it's basically simplicity done right. Popularity-wise, it is lacking a bit. So some answers might be a bit difficult to find online, and a lot of communities are still very small. But thanks to Fireship, this seems to be taking a turn, and might become a bit more popular in the future, but for right now the popularity is still a little bit low. In my opinion, Lua used to be one of my favorite programming languages, and for a very good reason. And it's incredibly fun to code in, and as for that, I'm going to bump it up a little bit. Being a bit this here in B tier. But if you don't care about performance, this could easily go into A tier. Kotlin. So Kotlin is basically Java, but simplified. This means that the performance is relatively similar to Java. Oftentimes it's the same. This means the performance isn't the best, but it's still pretty good for most things. Syntax-wise, it's easy to read and it's clean. There are no semicolons required, and we use brackets, which are both plus points in my book. Learning difficulty isn't very difficult. It's a very small language, so you can learn it in a few days with ease. But whilst Kotlin is easy to learn, its file structure can be a bit difficult for newcomers, and Gradle can also be a bit difficult to learn if you're just getting started. This causes the actual use difficulty to also increase because then the file structure will get bigger and Gradle will become more complex. Popularity-wise, whilst Kotlin is now the official language to use when creating Android apps, its popularity is still lacking. So finding answers and tutorials and learning resources can be a bit difficult, unfortunately. In my opinion, I like the language. If I ever want to have an app that can run on all platforms with the JVM, Java Virtual Machine, I'll choose Kotlin because it's better than Java in my opinion, and it still gives me all of the nice features Java has. So it would be my first choice for such an application. Overall, it's B tier. MySQL. Performance-wise, I think MySQL is relatively fast. I couldn't really get any statistics to really support or deny this, but I'm assuming it is pretty fast. Syntax-wise, whilst the syntax is easy to understand, I find it ugly and easily become very complex, and more difficult to follow along the larger the query gets. But because the syntax is so easy to understand and so close to English, the learning difficulty is much lower because it's like speaking English. So memorizing the basics is easy. The actual difficulty of using this in a real life example, well, in practice a lot of people don't write out pure MySQL queries anymore. They use a library to do it for them instead. So it's safe to say it becomes more difficult in practice, and the danger of executing the wrong query that modifies the database is too scary. I've seen a lot of times where people accidentally have a typo in their query, and this causes the entire database to be modified or deleted or something like that. Popularity-wise, it has been falling a bit since the rise of others such as MongoDB and PostgreSQL. Whilst it is currently still very popular, it will not be at the top spot forever. But thanks to its popularity, the community is large and the answers to your questions are easy to find. In my opinion, MySQL is great. I enjoy using it, and after all these years still remember most of it, even if I never type it out myself anymore. Overall, this gets a C. Python. Well, I think we can just skip performance because Python is very popular for its slow performance. Maybe a little bit too popular, so we can just skip this section. Syntax. Well, the syntax is pretty easy to understand, but it does annoy a lot of people because it uses tabs and spaces instead of brackets. This also often causes indentation errors and trouble knowing where a code block ends. The learning difficulty isn't very high. Python is now often taught in schools and university because of how easy it is to learn, and it is regarded as one of the easiest programming languages in the world. The actual use difficulty is easy. However, just like with JavaScript, learning libraries is your main goal, so the difficulty depends on the modules you're using. But overall, it's pretty easy to use if you find it in the wild. Python's ease of use and strange syntax has made it one of the most popular programming languages. The community is massive and friendly, and you'll usually not find any problems searching for answers to questions you have. And in my opinion, Python is my second favorite programming language. Other than its disgusting space-based syntax and slow performance, it is perfect in my eyes. So we can put it in B tier. Next up is Nim. Performance-wise, Nim was built with the idea of having speed similar to C++, but with the ease of use of Python. It can also compile to C and C++, which helps with performance. The syntax is very similar to Python, so it's easy to read, but it uses spaces instead of brackets. Not a very smart decision on their part, if I had to guess. This is sometimes a deal breaker for a lot of people. Nim is fairly easy to learn, and it has a relatively good documentation, which makes it even easier, and that with the Python-like easiness, about as easy as you're going to get for a statically typed language. In terms of using it or finding it in the wild being used, it has some drawbacks, just like with Python. So whether it's using spaces instead of tabs, or tabs and spaces instead of brackets, meaning you struggle seeing where something starts and where it ends and whatnot. And also, thanks to the language still being so young and unpopular, a lot of the libraries are either incomplete or have slowed down in development, or are just tedious to use. Popularity-wise, Nim is still pretty unpopular. With only a small but dedicated and incredibly friendly community, if you have a problem with Nim, chances are you're going to have to go ask that question on one of the community chats or on the Nim forum. It will probably not have been asked already. In my opinion, Nim, even with all of its drawbacks, by far is my most favorite programming language. I love types. I love Python. I love performance. And Nim has all of that for me. Unfortunately, even though I do love Nim so much, it's only going to get a C tier. If I had full control here, I'd give it an S tier because that's what it deserves. But it gets a C tier. C++. Performance-wise, it's about as good as it's going to get, unless you want to get down to assembly level. It's often used for creating performance-orientated software, like video editors and games. So performance-wise, it's really good. Syntax, well, syntax can look kind of ugly at times and be hard to read, especially if you're not skilled in C++. Some people code C++ for the syntax, whilst others never use it because of it. The learning difficulty I've personally found to be really easy. I've learned C++ and it was super easy to learn. However, I have heard a lot of people complaining that it is difficult to learn, and people should instead learn something else. Also, I'm still not sure if C++ has any official documentation, so there's that as well. So learning difficulty a little bit difficult, because if you learn from documentation, kind of difficult to find a reliable and easy to read C++ documentation. And generally people see C++ is difficult to learn. The use difficulty in the wild, it's pretty difficult. It requires dedication if you want to seriously code in it, and not just use it for small and fun projects. So if you really want to use this in a program you really want to grow big, you're going to have to be pretty dedicated, because it can get pretty difficult, especially once you get to trying to use libraries other people created. Popularity-wise, C++ is very popular. There are masses of resources to use if you want to learn it, or if you have questions. The community can sometimes be a little bit intimidating, and some of them are definitely not very friendly, but overall, the majority of them, as I have experienced, is pretty friendly. In my opinion, I enjoy coding in C++ occasionally. It is fun. I won't use it for anything serious though. But I do like coding small and basic programs in it. Or if I want to produce an executable file, like a .exe, then I like to go for C++. Therefore, C++ gets the very befitting rating of C, just without the plus. Pascal. Performance-wise, Pascal has mediocre performance. I've had a lot of performance issues while working with it, but have seen a lot of graphs showing that it has really good performance. But due to personal experience, I cannot give performance a point because I've had really bad performance with Pascal in the past. The syntax is relatively ugly, inconvenient, and downright difficult to understand at times. But some beginners could also find it easier to learn thanks to this syntax. But from personal experience, more people struggle with it than find it easy. Learning difficulty, well, Pascal is relatively easy to learn. Some schools choose to teach it because of it. However, online resources are scarce, which makes it more difficult to learn than it has to be. So if you're not in school, chances are you're going to have somewhat of a difficult time learning Pascal, your favorite way of learning. The in the wild use difficulty is pretty consistent with what you'd learn if you were to take a course in Pascal. There is a slight increase, but it's not that big. So if you learn Pascal, chances are the increase isn't too much. And if you use Pascal with something like Delphi, then you're basically good to go because nothing will really change that much from what you have learned and what's in real life to be expected. Popularity-wise, well, it used to be very popular, but it is now a dying language with a very small community. And you'll often not find an answer to your questions online, which is quite unfortunate. Most of the people that do learn Pascal learn it because they're interested in just seeing it, but don't learn it as a full-on language they want to take on anymore. So even then, the little bit of community that's left, only a bit of that is actually still knowledgeable and will be able to help with your questions on Pascal. And in my opinion, its time has passed. There are much better languages out there. It's great for learners, but so is Python. It has decent performance, but so does C#, Go, and C++. Overall, it's not a language I would necessarily recommend. I personally find it to be more bearable than Java. But unfortunately, it's going to get an E tier here, just because the community is basically non-existent anymore. PHP. Performance, well, it's a little bit lacking, often falling behind JavaScript, which is already considered relatively slow. Syntax-wise, I love the syntax, but a lot of people complain that it looks ugly and makes it more difficult to read. So here it's more on how you see it. It's just like with Python. Some people hate Python because of the syntax, whilst other people love it because of the syntax. The learning difficulty isn't too high. PHP was one of my first languages I've learned, and I picked it up in no time. The actual use case difficulty of PHP becomes more complex in real-world projects compared to what you learn in the basics. So unfortunately, if you're going to learn something in PHP, or if you're going to learn PHP and you want to make a big project with it, you're probably going to have to learn quite a few extra things, and it's going to become quite difficult compared to what you have learned. Popularity, PHP is still used a lot over the web, but popularity is decreasing with the rise of Python, Node.js, and Go, and will at some point become obsolete. In my opinion, I think PHP is a great language. However, seeing PHP developers get such a low salary compared to other developers also doing web development breaks my heart in two. So I don't recommend PHP except if you want to learn how to create your very first dynamic website, or if you want an easy starting point into dynamic web development. So unfortunately, PHP gets D here. Didn't get E thanks to its syntax, but it could possibly fall into E depending on what you see with its syntax. And thanks to its learning difficulty, it was also bumped up. Last but not least, BrainFuck. Performance-wise, I have absolutely no idea. But I've seen some people say that it can beat C performance, whilst others have performance issues. Therefore, it's both faster than C and slower than Python. Syntax-wise, it is the most beautiful, disgusting, interesting and difficult syntax I have ever had the pleasure of seeing. The learning difficulty, well, thanks to it being so basic, it's incredibly easy to learn and can be done in a few minutes. However, to some, it can be more difficult to understand how it works due to the syntax. The use difficulty is both as easy and as difficult in real environments as it would be after learning the basics. So it becomes more difficult as well as staying the same difficulty. Popularity-wise, BrainFuck is one of the, if not the, most popular esoteric programming language, but overall is not a very popular programming language. And in my opinion, it's both the best and the worst programming language to ever have existed. Therefore, we have a problem. It is S tier, but because of how it is made, I cannot accept it as S tier. So I will have to duplicate it and make it F tier as well. BrainFuck is the only language worth learning, as well as the only language you should never learn in your entire life. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all again in the next video.